This lecture is the second in our series on Reconstruction. This lecture will focus on the period of 1865 to 1873. The focus of this lecture is mostly on the freedmen, and the reason for that time period is it's the years that freedmen will get unprecedented rights under Reconstruction. Another thing that we focused on during this time will be Johnson's impeachment and the implications of it. The image here is a Freedmen's Bureau school, which was probably the greatest thing that the Freedmen's Bureau brought to the South. Presidential Reconstruction did not require Southern states to protect former slaves, and Southern states passed black codes to keep African Americans from gaining land, jobs, and protections under the law. In 1865, Congress created the Freedmen's Bureau to help former slaves. The agency provided emergency food, housing, and medical supplies. It promised former slaves 40 acres and a mule, but it never delivered. You can see there an image of former slaves lining up to receive their aid. Agents went to supervise labor contracts. As freedmen tried to gain jobs during Reconstruction, there were often disputes over white men receiving those jobs versus those freedmen and the opportunities to gain that land. Those jobs. And then, of course, the most important legacy of the Freedmen's Bureau was the creation of new schools. There you could see the percentage enrolled by whites and blacks. As you can see, it's pretty consistent for whites, in the 50 to 60% range of 5 to 19-year-olds in the South being enrolled. For blacks and other races, you go from just a little over 0% in 1850 to almost 32% by 1880. And that most significant increase is, of course, from 1870 to 1880. Just to show you the implications of those Freedmen Bureau schools, two pictures are there. Now, the Freedmen Bureau agents were going for good reasons. They were trying to rebuild the South. They were trying to bring opportunities, not just to freedmen, but also to poor whites in the South. And they built schools and hospitals, provided all sorts of aid. But not everyone was there for good purposes. There was a lot of criticism that some Northerners came to South to take advantage of the South's plight. Any Northerner who came to the South got the nickname the carpetbagger. Former abolitionists and profiteers moved to the South and were called carpetbaggers. Some of those are going to take advantage of the South's horrible economy, and they're going to buy up the land very cheap and sell it for high prices. They're going to build industry and hire people, but not necessarily have equity in hiring practices, things like that. And so carpetbaggers often got a really negative connotation in the South. Freedmen's Bureau, the emphasis on education, led to the creation of universities, such as Morehouse College in Atlanta. You guys might know of the traditionally black college, Howard University, which is here in D.C. As you can see, a large number of traditionally black colleges in the South came from states that had Freedmen's Bureau schools. Okay, you see a large number were built in that area. Whereas before the Civil War, the only two traditionally black colleges you have is one in Pennsylvania and one in Ohio. So that emphasis on education is really, really going to help these schools emerge. Even with the Freedmen's Bureau, radical Republicans feared that Johnson's lenient Reconstruction plan would violate black civil rights. So Congress drafted the 14th Amendment that included former slaves as citizens and guaranteed all citizens equal protection under the law. As you remember from the previous lecture, Congress also will take control of Reconstruction in order to try to protect those freedmen. And part of that will be with the Reconstruction Act of 1867, where the South was divided into 5 military zones. And to be readmitted, those states had to ratify that 14th Amendment, protecting black citizenship. Also, ex-Confederate states were required to give black men the right to vote on the state level. Those 5 military zones are going to be what leads to Johnson's impeachment. President Johnson obstructed the Congressional Reconstruction by firing military generals appointed by Congress to oversee Southern military zones. There was also a new law called the Tenure of Office Act, which said that if you were finishing out someone else's term of office, like Johnson was finishing out Lincoln's term of office because Lincoln had been assassinated. When you were finishing out someone else's term of office, you couldn't fire anyone appointed from the previous term. So in other words, Johnson couldn't fire anyone appointed by Lincoln until he was in his own term of office. That's called the Tenure of Office Act. So he violated the new law when he tried to fire his Secretary of War, who supported Congress's plan. Radical Republicans used this opportunity to impeach the president. Impeachment only means to be brought up on a crime, to be charged with a crime. The House of Representatives will vote 126 to 47 to charge Johnson with a crime. With impeachment, the House brings up the charges, but the Senate oversees the trial and votes. The Senate, in essence, is the jury. They vote on whether or not a person is guilty and should be removed from office. So there's a picture of an actual impeachment ticket, or a ticket to see the impeachment trial. After an 11-week trial, the Senate fell one vote short of removing the president from office. 2 Republicans voted based on the evidence or their own conscience, and they voted against removing Johnson from office. They'll actually sacrifice their own political careers to do so. Johnson had successfully argued that he had not committed a high crime or misdemeanor. So in 1868, Civil War hero Ulysses S. Grant will win the presidency as a Republican candidate. President Grant had worked with Congress to enforce Reconstruction. They're going to pass laws like the Enforcement Acts, which will limit the Ku Klux Klan's actions in the South. They'll also pass the Civil Rights Act of 1868, which will try to give more civil rights to the freedmen. By 1870, all ex-Confederate states were readmitted to the United States, but they still had military officials in the South protecting voters and freedmen from intimidation, both voting intimidation as well as just intimidation in general from the KKK. During Congressional Reconstruction, African Americans experienced unprecedented rights. The 15th Amendment gave black men the right to vote in 1870. The first black politicians, like those in the picture here, were elected to state and national office. The picture is of the first congressman, African American congressman, to serve in the 1870 Congress. Literacy and education will increase among blacks. Black families were reunited. Marriages were legally recognized because blacks could now enter into legal contracts. And black workers can make their own money. Reconstruction will bring economic changes to the South. After the Civil War, the Southern economy became more diverse, with new iron, steel, and textile mills. You can see in this image, you have the Queen of Industry, or in the New South, who's working at one of those textile mills. So in 1882, now the South is industrialized, with African Americans able to earn a wage as they are in the background. Unlike in 1861, where King Cotton was standing on the backs of the black man. This new industrial economy required hired workers. And so as you can see, the government is going to help build railroads and help repair the South. This new South will emerge from the ruin of 1865, as this image shows. The Civil War had ended slavery, but African Americans had little job training or money for farmland. So with few other options, most ex-slaves returned to the plantation to work. This is considered one of the failures of Reconstruction, and though in the next lecture, Failures of Reconstruction, is focused more of the intimidation of the KKK and groups like the White League, the crop lien system that comes from this time period, the sharecropping cycle, is also a huge failure of Reconstruction because it fails to provide the African American the opportunity to get out of the cycle of debt, and they're almost turned to almost a type of slavery because they have to stay on the plantation, often the plantations they were just freed from. So when it comes to the sharecropper cycle of poverty, if we start at the top, sharecropper is provided with land and seed. In exchange, he promised the landowner half the crop. The sharecropper will buy food and clothing on credit from the landowner's store. They will then plant and harvest the crop. The sharecropper gives the landowner crop to sell. The sharecropper will get half of the earnings minus the cost of the purchases for his year. White landowners will rent parcels of their field to blacks in exchange for 1/2 to 1/4 of the cotton they produced. When settling up, landowners said that the sharecropper owes more than he has earned. In order to pay the debt, the sharecropper must promise to the landowner a greater share of the next year's crop. So tenants had no money for tools or seeds, so they gained loans from the landowners in exchange for their cotton, which is a crop lien system. Because as you can see here, they stay in the cycle of poverty where they can never come out, because if they don't pay off their debts, they could end up going to prison, a debtor's prison, where they would end up working on a plantation in a chain gang, working to pay off their debt that way. By the end of 1865, most freedmen had returned to work on the same plantations on which they were previously enslaved. Sharecropping remained in place until the 1940s. The next lecture, which will be the last lecture in the series, will focus on the failures of the Reconstruction. It will focus on the black coats, the rise of the KKK, voter and black intimidation by the KKK, and then the end of Reconstruction through the Compromise of 1877.